I'm Jeremy and I'm here at the TRQ Research and Development Facility today, where we test all of our parts on a fleet of vehicles. And now I'm going to help you repair yours. We're going to crack these lug nuts loose while the car is on the ground, because once we jack up the car, it'll be much easier to take these lug nuts off. These are 21mm lug nuts. So now that the car is up in the air, we're going to take each one of these lug nuts off and then pull the wheel off. So I've now just taken off all 5 lug nuts, and as you can see, the wheel is stuck on the hub. So the easy way to fix this is to put one of the nuts back on. Just put it on finger tight. You're just trying to prevent the wheel from not falling off unexpectedly. And then we're going to go to the back side of the wheel and pop it off with a pry bar. We're going to just put it up here against the ball joint and pry against the wheel. And as you can see, it pops right off. And then we'll take the wheel off the car. So we want to remove this nut right here on the axle, but as you can see, it's been stamped down into this groove, and that holds it in place, so you don't need a cotter pin on it. But we need to basically bend this nut upward so that we can then spin the nut off and not destroy all the threads. If you were to just spin it off right now, you'd probably damage all these threads as you pull it off because this is dented downward. So what we're going to use is a punch and a hammer. And we're just going to tap on the inside of this to move this upward. All right, starting to move. So this center nut is a 30mm 12-point nut, which means you need a socket like this to remove it. And the tricky part is, if you try and turn this right now, it's going to turn the whole axle and the rotor as you're trying to loosen it. So there's a couple ways that you can deal with this. You can sometimes put the wheel back on the car and then take the center cap off. You have to set the car back on the ground, and then you can put the socket right through the center of the wheel with the wheel on the ground, and you can crack this loose, and then you can spin it off. Another method is, if you have a friend, you can have a friend hop inside the car and hold the brakes, and that'll hold the brake still, and then you can take this off with a big 1/2-inch breaker bar. The other option is you can use an impact gun, which is what we're going to use. That way you don't need a friend inside the car and you don't need to put the wheel back on. So let's see how it goes. All right, that worked out pretty well. So this axle should be able to push in through the center of the hub, but it doesn't because it's rusty. So there's a couple ways to get around this. My favorite one is putting this nut right back on. You want to put it on until it's just about flush with the end, right here. And then I'll spray a little rust penetrant in there, so maybe it'll get inside where the axle is. And then I'm going to tap this with a hammer. And the reason I put the nut back on is because I don't want to damage the threads if I miss with the hammer. And if I did miss and I damaged the threads, then I would need to fix it. But with the nut on there, you at least hit the nut instead of the threads. It's a little easier to deal with. So let's see how it goes. All right, so that worked pretty great. So now you know the axle is loose, and now you can take the nut back off. Now we're going to be loosening these 2 bolts, but before we get to that, we want to disconnect the ABS sensor and the brake line from the strut, because we're going to be moving this whole knuckle downward, and we don't want to put any tension on these 2 items. So we're going to take this 14mm right here. We're going to take it out of the strut, and that will release the brake hoses from the strut. All right, that's now out. So now we can pull this one off, and then this one as well. All right, so right down here, you'll see another little clip, and that needs to be removed with a pick. So we're going to just pop a pick in here, pull that loose, and then we can pull the ABS sensor hose out, or ABS sensor wire out. So now we can attack these 2 strut bolts. I'm going to spray a little rust penetrant on them to make the whole job a little easier, and then we'll crack them loose with a 1/2-inch breaker bar and a 22mm socket. So, rust penetrant. All right, now let's see how this works. All right, it's pretty tight, but loose now. All right, now it looks like the whole bolt's turning, so I'm gonna need to put a wrench on this side. So now I got the 22 on this side and a 22 on this side. All right, and then I'm gonna move to the lower one. All right, before we take these two bolts out, just to be safe, we're gonna pull the ABS sensor out of the hub. Now it's only held in there with one 10mm bolt. So we're gonna use a 10mm socket on a 1/4 drive ratchet, and we're just gonna crack that bolt loose and pull the bolt out. There we are. All right, so the ABS sensors tend to be stuck in the knuckle, so we're gonna use some pliers and ever so gently turn it to hopefully break it free from its grip. All right, there we are. So now we've pulled the ABS sensor out. Can clean some of the rust off of it, and we'll set it aside to reinstall later. All right, so now we're gonna knock these two bolts out. Usually if you push on the brake rotor, it'll relieve some pressure on these bolts and pull them right out. There we are. Okay, so now we can fold this knuckle down and push on the axle until the axle pops out the back of the hub. There we are. All right, so on the inside where it meets the transmission, we're gonna put a pry bar in between the axle and the transmission housing, and we're just gonna pop it out. Just before you pop this axle out, make sure you have a bucket underneath it, because once the axle pops out, you're gonna drip some transmission fluid. All right, with it cracked loose, now we can pull the axle right out of the transmission. You're gonna find that it leaks some transmission fluid, so we're gonna have to top off the transmission fluid once we put the new axle in. Right here we have the old axle, and you can see it came out and it has this clip on the end of it. This clip is what holds it into the transmission. It kind of like snaps in. That's what you're popping out when you remove it with the pry bar. And you can see the new one has the same clip on it as well. So you know it'll lock in properly. It also has this new seal cover on here, so if you damage yours on the way out, like we did, it obviously comes with a new one, so you don't have to worry about that. On the opposite end, you can see that it comes with a new nut. So if you did damage your old one getting it off, which is fairly common, you have a new one to work with. So overall, you can see the same length, same general look, and it should get your car fixed up right. All right, so once you have your axle out, you're gonna find that there's a seal right here, and there's gonna be some fluid dripping out of it. So this is a good time to inspect the seal and make sure that it's nice and clean and not damaged. If your axle was leaking before you pulled the axle out, this would be a great time to replace that seal. It just pops out and you can pop a new one back in. In this case, the axle seal seems that it is in fine shape, so we are just going to kind of wipe it down, and then we're going to put the axle in. And the way that you put the axle in is you go in through the front here, and you slide it into the transmission, and it needs to snap into place, so you have to kind of give it a shove to lock it in. There we go. All right, so now it's locked in. You can feel it when it locks in, and if you look on the bottom, you can see that it actually is right up against the transmission, and there's a seal cover that's on the axle that covers up the seal and prevents dirt from getting in there. On the outer end of the axle, what we need to do is tip it so the splines line up with this hole in the hub, and then we're going to slide the axle right in through the middle of the hub until it comes out the other side. All right, so now the splines are lined up, and we can lightly put on the nut. All right, so now I have the two strut bolts, and we need to line up the knuckle with the strut so that we can get these bolts in. All right, now we just got to get the nuts on the bolts. And the lower one. And now we'll tighten those up just hand tight for now, and then we'll torque them properly in a couple of minutes. So now I'm putting the 22 millimeter socket on here, and we're going to torque each one of these to 177 foot-pounds. And I have a wrench on the other side just in case it moves. All right, there's one. And there's two. Okay, so now we want to connect the brake hose and the ABS sensor to the strut. And it goes up in place like this. All right, and then we'll tighten that up. It's a 14 millimeter, so I'm just going to use my quarter drive ratchet and a 14. All right, they're in place. Now the ABS sensor clips right into this clip, right here, like that. And then down in the hub, we have our ABS sensor, which slides right back into the hole in the knuckle. And then there's a 10 millimeter that goes right here. And again, with a quarter drive ratchet and a 10 millimeter socket, I'm just going to tighten this up. All right, now it's tight. All right, so now we want to torque this to 159 foot-pounds. Now, since we have the other wheel on the ground, it's actually preventing this from spinning right now. But if you had both wheels off of the car, you would need to use the pry bar trick that I mentioned earlier. So I'll show you how to do that. You can do it just like this. I like to put a couple of lug nuts on to kind of hold the pry bar in place. And then as you turn this, it's going to put the pry bar down on the ground, and then you can torque. You can torque it to the right torque. And then, of course, you can remove your pry bar. Just like that. It's an easy way to do this without a friend. All right, so now we want to spike this nut down into this groove, and that will prevent it from coming off if it ever were to come loose. Now it shouldn't, because you torqued it to 159 foot-pounds, but you know, weird things happen. So what we're going to do is put our punch right here, and then we're going to whack it with a hammer like this. As long as I can hold it. So now we've speared that in place, and now it won't go anywhere. We can put the wheel back on the car. So we're going to lift it up, slide it right on. And then always start your lug nuts by hand, because you don't want to cross thread them. Now I like to tighten all these up by hand before I actually put the torque wrench on. That one's a little stiff, so we'll go to this one. All right, we've now got our torque wrench set to 76 foot-pounds. And we're going to go ahead and torque this. Now that it's back on the ground, we can torque it and the wheel won't turn. So let's do that. All right. I just like double checking them, just in case I missed one or something. All right, now we're all torqued.